Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Sharon Bell, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Strategy and Planning, and a recent addition to the Western Sydney University staff.
It's great to have you with us, by the way.
It's my great pleasure to be here with you, Vice-Chancellor, this afternoon to answer questions and to share our thoughts about our processes around reviewing the strategic plans, securing success, and also the associated academic structure. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting here in Parramatta Central, the Darug people, elders past, present and future. And I'd like to particularly welcome colleagues of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent who may be joining us here today at this meeting. Perhaps we'd note that today we have a meeting of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Elders on Campus Advisory Committee, and the Vice-Chancellor and I have had the pleasure of speaking to them this morning. I thought I'd begin by perhaps just saying a very brief few words about our process to date. Everyone would have had the availability of the discussion paper, which is really a paper to prompt our earliest discussions. We've been focused over the last couple of weeks on meeting with and discussing the issues arising with academic leaders within the university. So far we've met with executive staff, division leaders and most of the deans. And I'm trying to get out to each of the campuses in turn. We also have a white paper that will be prepared and we'll go to the next meeting of the Academic Senate, and then we will prepare a green paper based on the feedback that we get over time. So the first iterations of our process obviously concentrate on teasing out some of the big issues. So our conversation today, we expect to be at a reasonably high level. We haven't yet got down to any fine-grained modelling because we don't want to preempt the outcomes of those early discussions. The conversations, I think I'd say as a newcomer, have been incredibly productive, and people have been very engaged with the process. We've received about 22 submissions to date, and so many of the questions that we've got framed for today's discussion are based on those submissions. And over the last few days, it's been interesting, just the last couple of days, we've begun to receive really quite detailed submissions from some parts of the university and some schools, which are canvassing the issues in a deeper way. And I'm sure we'll receive more of these over the coming weeks. So I feel a bit, Vice-Chancellor, I feel a bit like Tom Gleeson here today. So perhaps we're going to call this Academic Strategy and Planning Hard Chat.
I see.
We've tried to actually tease out the hard questions from the submissions we've got, but perhaps to begin with, we've had some lively discussion here at 1PSQ already today, so I might actually do the bold thing and throw open to the audience to begin with. Are you happy if we do
More
that?
than happy for that, yes. Let's go to Terry in the front row, in fact. Terry Sloan. There's a mic coming around, Terry. No, Terry.
Sorry.
Okay. First question is, the pendulum swinging again. Why has it taken so long to swing back to faculties?
We had a pre-chat about this question, actually, Terry, a few minutes ago. You'll know. When I first arrived in 2014, I think I've said this a couple of times in discussions, both in live streams and with staff around the university. When I arrived in 2014, the new structure, the current flat structure, had only been in place a relatively short amount of time, 18 months, 2 years. And as I went around the university talking to people in those first few months, and I remember, Terry, you attended a few of those sessions with me at the time, to gauge the concerns of staff right across the university in a range of ways, it occurred to me that we hadn't had an opportunity to really see if this flat structure was going to work, and to come in immediately into another change process so quickly, I felt was not in the interest of the university at the time. We had some big issues we needed to address and take forward, and some of those needed to deal with issues around our administrative staffing arrangements, communication across the organisation, our postgraduate coursework programs, international reach and so on. These were critical matters, as well as, at the time, it was right on the verge of deregulation and the debate of 2014 with Christopher Pyne and the development of our strategic plan. So these things, in my view at the time, took precedence over going back and revisiting academic structure. 3.5 years on, as the discussion paper suggests, with a changing policy context nationally and I think a range of external pressures that we can talk about, and halfway through a strategic planning cycle and a need to make sure that we're positioning the university appropriately to respond to those external pressures, we should at the same time reflect on the structure. Is it right for this moment and going forward? Is it consistent with what we want to achieve in the strategic planning context? Is it appropriate to enable us to respond to some of the volatility we're seeing in the sector? So I think now's the time to have the conversation. And so I think the pendulum may have swung. I'm not sure it's swung all the way to change yet, and that's something we'll talk about in the course of the next few minutes.
So perhaps that's a good opportunity, Vice-Chancellor, to follow up with the question. Some of the discussions and some of the submissions have suggested that, in fact, the outcome of this process is a fait accompli. So it would be really useful to know whether you are actually really open to maintaining the status quo, and would this mean no change?
Well, it certainly isn't a fait accompli. In fact, one of the concern that this mic is okay. Okay. No, it's certainly not a fait accompli. And I think if I'd already made up my mind that we needed to move to a particular structure, then I would have gone to the university community with that suggestion and worked through a process of consultation around it. No, it's not a fait accompli. I think I'm certainly open to argument and suggestion and proposal. And I think this discussion paper highlights that. There are a range of options that it canvasses. But equally, I think there are other options that we might want to consider, and I'm waiting to see the feedback from that process. One of the reasons I was very keen for you, Sharon, to come and be involved in the consultation process is your background over a number of years in a number of institutions, including working with me at Charles Darwin University through change processes, but at Canberra, Griffith, Wollongong, elsewhere in the sector, a deep understanding of some of the challenges of change, of academic structure. I thought it was your background gave an additional element to this process. So no, it's not a fait accompli, and I'm looking forward to the feedback. As to whether there is going to be no change at all, I think we need to appreciate the circumstances we're in as an institution, and we've been canvassing those pretty broadly, and the particular circumstances we find ourselves in at the moment and the next few years, and they'll certainly be challenging ones. So I think we do need to see some change. I think change is important. I think now is the time to consider it, how significant and how comprehensive it is. I think we're on a spectrum of possibilities here, and I'm looking forward to the feedback. This needs to be a series of conversations that test assumptions, test suggestions and proposals, and make sure that we land at a place that I think positions the university appropriately for the future. So in that context, there will be change, but I'm certainly open to the breadth and the scope of that change. You've done some work on change processes in other universities. How do you think we shape up in terms of the change process we're trying to go through, the consultation we're going through?
Well, I think the hallmarks of any successful change process for me are the degree to which you actually do involve colleagues in the discussions in a meaningful way. Probably the worst processes I've seen are those where there is a charade around a process of consultation, and you come up with the answer that you always wanted in the first place. And I also think part of that process is because our colleagues will all have different experiences of the institution, and the outcomes will be so much richer and so much more appropriate if we're factoring those into where we actually get. It's also really critical if we want to actually change structures with a hope that we will in some ways improve our outcomes, that our colleagues are going along that journey with us. If we embark on a change process where people don't come along with us, it's very unlikely, even though we might change the structure, it's unlikely that we will actually change the outcomes and achieve what we want to achieve.
And I think that as an example, when we developed the strategic plan, Securing Success in late 2014 into 2015, we undertook a process where from the discussion paper through to the final plan, through the draft plan, there were a number of changes made to reflect the feedback from colleagues across the organisation, and we fed back detailed responses to all of the suggestions that were made. I think we'll do the same here. I think we certainly need to respond to the good ideas and capture them as appropriate and ensure that we improve the outcome accordingly.
So that's probably a good idea to actually go back to that question of the strategic plan. One of the areas of feedback we've had to date is that perhaps the strategic plan, while it's fine, doesn't necessarily adequately represent the distinctiveness of Western Sydney University. Some people have said to us, well, you could take this plan and you could just insert the name of another university and it would probably read quite credibly. Do you think that's the case? Do you think we need to be working harder on that question of having a stronger distinctive vision and distinctive place within the sector and ensuring that our strategic plan reflects that?
I think it's one of those discussion points that's worth embedding in the process and that we should tease that out. When we put the plan together, we were grappling, I guess, with a couple of challenges. One is that the university at sort of around at the time 25 years of age, relatively young despite the history of our antecedent institutions, despite that, relatively young, and a university that had moved through a federation that was very problematic in many ways, and then under Jan Reid's leadership to forge a single university, the University of Western Sydney at the time, and with a very strong commitment to its region, not just reflected in the actions of the institution, but reflected in the Act under which we are empowered to deliver higher education and research in Western Sydney. So it's a strong and compelling argument to see that rich community engagement element and our commitment to our region and to opportunity, to access, to participation, to equity being fundamental to what makes us the institution that we are. But also to account for the globalisation of higher education, the international dimension to what we are trying to achieve, the fact that, as I said at a number of times as we put the plan together, we don't do justice to our region if we don't have global aspiration and we aren't globally relevant and we're not tackling problems that resonate in our region, absolutely, but also have global significance. And we needed to begin the journey in the next phase of development of the university that recognised that. So we needed to bring these elements together in the plan. Now, 3 years on, I do think we need to reflect on that. Distinctiveness is something that crops up whenever you talk about strategic planning in any organisation. What's distinctive about Western Sydney University or Charles Darwin University, where we had this conversation many times about what was distinctive about the university in the Northern Territory, and there were many things that were distinctive about that institution, as there are for us. There is also, I think, a challenge that our strategic planning seems vanilla and doesn't seem to draw out those distinctive elements. And if that's the case, I think we need to address it. It does have some very strong statements about leadership and advocacy for our region, which was, in fact, subtle though it might seem, a significant step from where we were, which was to support and be part of our community, but not necessarily lead and advocate on behalf of the region. So there was some, I think, strengthening of language in this plan. We need to see if we should go further. Something you and I have been talking about today during Reconciliation Week is whether our commitment to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in our region, in the largest urban community, in fact, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, is that strong enough? Is it explicit enough, our commitment? And I'm not sure it is. I think it needs to be made bolder, and particularly in light of Universities Australia's new Indigenous strategy, which I think is a very strong expression of that. And the concept of student-centeredness is not yet, I think, as clearly understood as we need it to be. And is it actually impacting and influencing all that we do. And of course, that was the intent, but I'm not sure that's the case yet. So there are questions we have to ask about distinctiveness. I think there are elements there. If they're not strong enough, we need to draw them out. Now's the opportunity to do it.
Thank you. I thought one of the lovely moments at the meeting this morning with our elders was when one of the elders talked about living for over 20 years in a house in Penrith, and she said when she first lived there, you know, the people who walked down the street all looked the same, and it gave her great pleasure to sit on her veranda and look at people taking their children to school and moving down the street, and seeing so many people from so many cultures and from so many backgrounds. So the globalisation imperative is there, but also it is a reflection of the way in which Western Sydney as a place has actually changed in that period that you're talking about.
And I think similarly, if we look ahead from here at the region that we now imagine, the future of this region that we can now imagine, I think we imagine a different future than what we might have done even just 5 or so years ago. And I think we need to ensure that our plan reflects that.
We might go to another question from the floor, but just before I do that, I am reminded that I'm to ask those who are joining us by live stream, reminded that you can actually feed questions into us if you wish to. So thank you. I think we have a question.
Yeah, okay. This feeds a bit, I guess, on the conversation you just had. My question is really, are there clear strategic imperatives that you've got that are leading you down this path? My background, as you know, is in industry, and typically significant restructurings, you can clearly see what the focus is of that, because at worst, the restructuring might just be moving chairs around. So I guess I'm really keen to see, do you have 1 or 2 strategic imperatives that are really driving you to say this will produce material benefits that will be very apparent?
Well, I think there are a number of dimensions to why we're considering the need for change. Put it in that context for a moment, come to how we might interpret strategic imperatives. One of them is, and in fact we had a strategic workshop for the executive committee of the university just last week, where for the first time we were seeing the results of some very detailed work that we've been doing to try and understand better the dynamics of our region when it comes to recruiting students, both undergraduate and postgraduate students in the domestic context of our region, and beyond that, the actions and activities of our competitors and the environment we're finding ourselves in, which is something we hadn't anticipated 2 years ago. In fact, when we put this plan together, we had much more aggressive growth targets for the university, even in the short term. And that was coming off the back of some strong growth in 2013 and 2014 into 2015. But we're not seeing that materialise. So one of the strategic imperatives that we need to ensure that the university is positioning itself to respond to the educational market that we find ourselves in. And I've said this on a number of occasions, you know, the national policy settings, which we support in the context of the demand-driven system, for example. But those policy settings have interesting repercussions when you're in a period with relatively slow growth, or in fact, no growth at all. And in school leaver terms, that's the situation we're in here in Western Sydney, in Sydney, in fact, in New South Wales more broadly. Non-current school leavers were in decline. So we're in a demand-driven system with a lot of competition. So there's a strategic imperative here to ensure that the university structurally and our planning framework enables us to be successful in that context. The next level down, the other dimensions really relate to, well, recognising those challenges. How do we best structure ourselves to enable us to manage the volatility of the circumstances we face? And that's the question we're putting in the context of, our faculty structures, for example, going to give us more capacity to manage volatility and change, and also potentially to enable us to be more innovative and creative, more multi and cross-disciplinary in what we're doing. Although that's possible in a flat structure, we're not seeing as much of it as I think we need to see. And there are various other reasons we could touch on. So I think this is the moment for us, and it coincides, the academic restructure conversation is coinciding with the refresh of the strategic plan. And I think one of the dimensions that Sharon brought to this conversation with me early on when we were talking about it was we really should be placing these in the same conversation, because in refreshing the strategic plan and to emerge from that process with what I hope will be a stronger plan to guide us over the next 3 years than we currently have, well, that should influence the structure that we need to best support the plan. So these things come hand in hand. The last thing I'll say is, coming back to that set of challenges that I've spoken about quite frequently, they're not going to disappear in the short term. Okay, this is a reality that we're all facing. We monitor the trends going out several years. There's great growth coming into Western Sydney. There's no doubt about that. But that's growth that will come over the course of a decade and beyond. Young families will be moving to west of the M7. You have an extra 1 million people over the course of the next 15 years. And yes, there will be growing school leaver numbers, but not in the short term. We need to ensure the university is robust to move through and to be successful when we do see that growth return in the domestic market.
So one of the questions that's related to that discussion that came in the submissions was, if we actually in fact had a more hierarchical faculty-based structure over the last 5 years, what would have been different? Would we have fared better?
It's an interesting question, somewhat hypothetical in a sense, but look, I think that you and I both know from experiences around the sector that whatever structure you have in place, the defining characteristic of success is quality leadership, collegiality, the way in which our teams work together within our faculties and schools to deliver the strategic intent of the organisation and respond to the challenges that we face. So I'm sure that had we had a different structure, I'm not sure that we would have been necessarily better placed. Now, I have high regard for our deans and the leadership in our schools at the moment in the work that we've done over the last few years. But that, I think, should be taken in the context of equally the challenges of a flat structure when we're in a region that's undergoing tremendous change. And how do we ensure the university is positioned well externally, in the role I play in that regard, and how we can support those schools or faculties more appropriately. So I'm not sure we would have been better off or worse off. From what I've heard of the college structure, it had some real challenges to it. I think the way resourcing was distributed, duplication, and a whole range of challenges of that structure meant it was timely to reflect on it when that occurred under the previous leadership and to consider change. We need to learn from that. We need to learn from what we know of other structures around the sector, and we use examples like Newcastle, and I was involved, came into Newcastle when they were changing structure to see what's happened at La Trobe in its recent very dramatic changes. The structure at universities like Griffith and Deakin. I often use these universities, they've existed longer as universities than we have. They have many similar characteristics. They deal with multi-campus challenges. In some cases, they have medical schools and other similarities to ourselves. They often cater for communities of educational disadvantage and how to deal with those, and often areas of growth like the Gold Coast and Griffith and so on. So I think there's a lot to learn, and I think we have to bring that information in, not just our internal dialogue, but let's reflect on what's working elsewhere and what's successful, what's helping universities to position themselves well, learn from that, as well as creating our own future.
Rugby, I think you had a question, and then there's one down the back.
Rugby.
Okay, this may be a hard question. How did you measure?
This is hard chat.
A different model. Okay, do it again. Yeah. This may be a hard question. How did you measure?
Well, we haven't, in a sense, reflected on the different models that in a quantitative way to measure their efficiency one against the other. What I've made very clear is if we do decide to change, we shouldn't be driven by efficiency as the reason for change. And we're going through a very detailed shared services review at the moment and implementation. And that is something I know that is causing anxiety and concerns across the university. It's a very big change process. And I'm very intent on ensuring that that process is resolved quickly. And it's related to our current structure, and I don't apologise for that. I'm not presuming a structure into the future. But we then, if we choose to go into faculty structure, we'll use the resources we have to support our faculty. So it will be a structure that will be cost neutral, whatever we change to, because we cannot afford to be providing more resources at the moment. It's a challenging time. So in that sense, the efficiencies will be predetermined. We need to deliver on them. Over time, we can look at further change. But again, I draw comparisons from other institutions to say that, there are pros and cons for flat structures. There are pros and cons for faculty structures and other clustering arrangements. And we'll explore that during the consultation process.
So the issue of particularly the cost structure has been one which has been raised by a number of people. And there is certainly a perception, I think, amongst some colleagues that if we actually were to move to a faculty structure, that would actually mean that there was another layer of executive salaries and there would be higher costs. So how would the financial position of the university be improved with a faculty structure, do you think?
Well, initially, as I said, it's a matter of entering into any new structure with a cost-neutral view. And as I said, it's not one of driving further efficiency as the reason for it. Over time, of course, over a transition period and over the course of the next strategic planning cycle, the next 3 years, the university does need to recover its position, which means we need to see ourselves more successful in attracting students, particularly students in Sydney, domestic students in Sydney and the Sydney region. This is by far and away our most difficult issue to resolve for us. The last couple of years have demonstrated that to us very clearly, but it's not a pattern in the last couple of years. In some areas, it's going back several years. And, the competitive nature of the sector, as I've said, is part of that, but there's more to it. It's more about the design of our curriculum, the structure of our curriculum, and we're doing a project to address that at the moment that Denise Kirkpatrick and Simon Barry are working on. That's going to be an equally important project for us over the course of the next 18 months in particular. So we need to work within the financial resources we have available to us, and we will. We need to transition through a period of change, which we will. We certainly need to be doing this on the basis that we will be more attractive to the recruitment of students in our region and internationally. We also need to be confident that we're going to enhance the student experience, and we need to look at ways we can do that. Partly that will come, I think, out of innovation and creativity in our programs that we'll develop and deliver under a new curriculum architecture that we're working on, so that we'll give more flexibility to the programs we'll offer to students. And I think if we all reflected on it at the moment, for a whole range of historic reasons and campus reasons and other reasons, we have some real rigidity in our current programs, and that is not helping us in attracting students. And we need to step back from that and address it. So I'm confident that if we can draw on the input during this consultation process, that we will not only be able to do this in a cost-effective way, but we will enhance the student experience. And we're very committed to being student-centred in the way we go about it.
So, Vice-Chancellor, some colleagues have suggested that in fact a faculty structure would make the schools less agile and less flexible, and cross-collaboration between faculties harder. How would you respond?
Well, I mean, we can imagine all sorts of ways in which things could be less agile and less flexible. At the moment, as I said, I've got concerns about agility and flexibility. And you only have to look at, and we do watch very closely what our competitors are doing and their capacity to do it and their responsiveness and their proactive approach in a range of areas. And I think at the moment we are challenged to be as agile and flexible and responsive as we should be. So the current structure is not helping us in that regard. So I think we need to explore that. If we choose not to significantly change the current structure, as I come back to the question I mentioned earlier, we're going to have to find ways to better collaborate. And that's not simply within our schools or across our schools. It's between our schools and our research institutes, for example, as well, which we might come back to. So I think that, we should certainly be aiming to ensure that agility and flexibility are key characteristics of the new structure. Personally, I think there is advantages in larger faculty structures with, total resources being greater, bringing cognate disciplines together, and then to have a leadership team committed to bringing about the collaboration. And I think that argument could be a compelling one. But equally, let's listen to what the consultation tells us. It's a reasonable argument. Leadership is crucial in all of this as well.
I think we have another question up there.
Vice-Chancellor, I haven't been at the university for much longer than you, but one of the things I've heard about seems to reflect a very cynical and common statement about corporate strategy. I'm sure you've heard it. If it's centralised, decentralise. If it's decentralised, centralise. And as one of your comments implied, there are always good reasons to justify a different structure because there are always advantages and disadvantages. I also know when times are difficult, there's a real push for senior executive to do something to try and shake things up. But as you probably know much better than me, whatever you do, one, there are real costs in monetary costs and time costs. And there are also very big opportunity costs. Often they close an organisation to doing something else. So if we go ahead with a restructure, it's going to be a distraction for lots of people. One thing I have observed here since I came is, like many agile organisations, we're always trying to take on new opportunities, but that creates a lot of complexity. And I heard the CEO of Xerox say once, it's always easy to take on new products and projects. The very difficult thing is to stop doing things. She said that was our greatest challenge. So this will create an opportunity cost. Are you confident that if we went ahead, it would be the best use of your time and the university's time and resources?
It's a good question, quite a bit in it, actually. Worth unpacking elements of it. Am I confident? Well, I'm confident we're in a process at the moment that's consultative, and I want to hear the feedback that's coming through this process. And at the moment we've had some, but I'm looking forward to hearing more, and that argument is certainly part of it. But it's interesting to reflect on the challenges of whether you change or you don't change an organisation in a time of challenge. And, I don't want to put a stronger word on it than that, but, this has been a quite difficult period for the university. At the moment, we have over 300 courses that we offer. If you compare us to UNSW or UTS or anybody else, we are significantly over-offering programs. And it's a history of doing that to scramble for load. And the best estimates now, going back and looking at the business cases that have been put together to support the argument for a new program, almost in all cases, those programs deliver less than half the projected load that was estimated at the time. So you're right. We've got to be willing not only to consider new opportunities, because I think we would be derelict in our duty to our region if we didn't consider new opportunities when they arise, but equally we've got to have the courage to close things down and to move on when they're not working. And so the curriculum reform project and the architecture that we'll be putting in place should address that exact issue. And you're absolutely right. You cannot undertake a change process of the dimensions we're talking about. And at the moment, it's not simply about do we restructure our schools, but it's the shared services project itself. Without that costing us in not simply in economic terms, but in human terms. People are not just distracted by it. It takes a toll on people in going through change processes. What I'm very confident about is that we have to reposition Western Sydney University in the context of our region and Australia and the international context we operate in. And I think we're drawing on enough information to give us confidence that if we don't change some of the fundamentals, then the university will be in much more serious and difficult times than it is at the moment. And it's my responsibility to the Board of Trustees and to the university to ensure that we are robust and that we manage our way through in a sustainable way through periods of volatility. And that's what we're doing at the moment. The corporatisation element you touched on it is one that I've heard often, and it's a challenge to all of us in higher education in Australia as people get concerned about the corporatisation of universities. We operate, though, in the 2017 context of the funding of higher education very differently to the context of 20 years ago or 30 years ago. We no longer have caps on load. We no longer have our funding delivered in essentially a block grant from the Commonwealth. We are largely autonomous institutions, as we should be, self-accrediting higher education providers who undertake research, and we operate in a very complex market. And we are funded, and in our case, significantly funded, on the basis of the students that we can attract. And when you're in that sort of environment, when you've moved from a block grant environment to a student funding environment, it changes the way in which you need to operate your institution to ensure its long-term success and vitality. And of all the things we're doing that we've touched on, one of the others which is quite challenging is the way we reposition our campuses over the course of the next decade. And One Parramatta Square, the Peter Shergold building, is an example of that. The new Liverpool campus that will emerge in 2018 is another example of that. How do we develop our Westmead campus to provide a revenue stream for the university? How do we develop Campbelltown, as we have been doing, to ensure that we can build a corpus for the future? We don't, unlike the GO8s, we don't have a corpus. And a corpus can be a way, an endowment can be a way of giving us some of those resources to manage volatility. So we're in a very different environment than we were, and corporatisation is easily thrown around, but it's equally a challenge to operate in this sort of environment in any other way. What I think we have to try and do as successfully as we can is to engage in these sorts of processes collegially, consultatively, and take note of the feedback we're getting.
So that's probably an excellent segue to the question that has arisen in the submissions also about governance. If we were to move to a faculty structure, do you envisage that there would be a significant faculty level of governance and decision making?
I don't particularly want to preempt the outcome, so I don't want necessarily people to think that because I have a particular view, it will be compelling when we consider the feedback. But I can't imagine a faculty structure operating without significant faculty-based decision-making and governance arrangements, both in relation to resources and to obviously the academic programs. And, I don't think when we moved from colleges to schools, there was another layer of governance between schools and the Academic Senate and our Board of Trustees. That's been removed to school level to recognise the importance that we need to operate and empower our schools appropriately at that level. And I'm sure if we move to a faculty structure, it will be even a more compelling argument to ensure we have the appropriate governance arrangements at that level.
So one of the risks involved in having a faculty structure might be, and I know that one of our colleagues has raised this with you, Vice-Chancellor, that the distance between the student and the Vice-Chancellor potentially increases. And it's important if we are a student-centred institution, and also important just in terms of the successful governance and leadership of the institution, that the Vice-Chancellor, in fact, despite all your external commitments, has good vision of the institution and has ways to actually connect with colleagues and students within the institution.
It was the Dean of the School of Computing Engineering and Mathematics, Simeon Simov, who said to me, we were discussing structures and he was expressing views about that to me, and a colleague had spoken to him and said, very simply, student, dean, vice-chancellor, and that there's something very important about the proximity of the leadership of the institution to our students. And it was part of a conversation that I'd begun, in that case with Simeon, and I've been extending that in discussion with the other deans about the importance of a greater level of engagement between the leadership of the university and our students. And I know that I'm putting in place some processes to do that in my case this year. And I'm listening to the deans talking about the ways in which they engage with students. And Simeon's been doing this quite extensively, and it's been a very important process for him, not only at the level of problem solving on various issues, but also understanding about some of the challenges that students are facing in various programs at various times and in various ways. And he sees that as an important and valuable source of information and support that he can provide. But the simple statement of student, dean, vice-chancellor is quite a compelling one. And, I think it's another reason that we've got to be very careful to push the vice-chancellor further away, unless, of course, we have the right sorts of support around and the right mechanisms to ensure that that those information flows and the consultation is real.
There's another question here.
Okay, a few colleagues have submitted questions through the webinar. The first one, what type of structure might there be below the PVC Dean of Faculty and also within the schools beyond the head of school?
Look, this is a very good question, and I know some people have asked why didn't we, for example, address that in the discussion paper. And in a way, I'm throwing the question back. I think we're looking for suggestions in that regard. Terry and I were having a conversation about this a little earlier, reflecting on the previous structure, I think with the College of Business and Law, where there was a School of Law and several business schools in that structure. And I know if Michael Adams or Stephen Freeland were here from the School of Law, they'd probably express a view that perhaps was a structure that they felt isolated in the school with so many business-related schools alongside a law school. Now, we've got to be very careful about the resources that we can invest in very detailed substructures. So that needs to be taken into account. And my personal view is we wouldn't want to see a proliferation of schools. However, there are some arguments emerging, which I'm interested in listening to, about the way in which we cluster disciplines at the moment and whether there are better ways to do that. I'm interested in, with our intention, for example, just an example, to establish our architecture program and with the strength of our program in construction management, our work in urban planning, the work we have in design or geography, whether there is in fact an opportunity here to have a school of the built environment. Perhaps that's worth considering. It might mean a restructuring of existing disciplines. I think these ideas are worthy of consideration. And I think there's an ongoing challenge we have, which we don't necessarily talk about often enough, and that is the substructures we currently have. The DAP structures and other structures in schools, which, I get a lot of concern expressed about. And I think, Sharon, you've heard some of that in the consultation process. So I think this is an opportunity to hear from staff about the challenges and about more efficient and effective substructures that we could look at, bearing in mind, as it always needs to be, the financial considerations about the way we go about that.
And I think there's, our colleagues in management would be aware there's a current significant interest in the creation of communities of practice and, self-managed teams and how effective they are for effective organisations. So I think the fact that we haven't wanted to preempt outcomes by presenting models of substructures doesn't or shouldn't be read as an indication that we're not vitally interested in that issue. We know that on a daily basis, that is what colleagues experience. It's actually, where do you sit within the organisation? What sorts of collegial environment do you have around you? Whether it's disciplinary or interdisciplinary, what sort of strength and depth is there in that academic environment in which you're working, and how does it actually add to you meeting the expectations that you would like to meet and the university expects, and how can we actually, as a rapidly maturing institution, really enhance the depth of our knowledge systems and the people responsible for that.
But I think we're certainly in this process, we're inviting colleagues to reflect on this. This is certainly not a matter that we don't want to see.
Absolutely, and I think it's fair to say both in terms of overall structures and the substructures, we would really love to get, creative suggestions, lateral ideas. We're not closed at all to actually having structures that look quite different and might be quite distinctive.
Thank you both. The next question relates to the timing, which you've already touched on. Why wasn't this considered before the shared services project?
That's a good question, and a number of people have raised it about the order in which we're doing things, and I do accept that some colleagues suggested that, and appropriately, get the structure sorted out and then move through a shared services process. And I've reflected a lot on it. I've reflected on whether we should hold back on the shared services review at the time and instead get the restructure discussion completed. I think it's my view, given the circumstances we face as an organisation at the moment, that the shared services process is extremely important and we need to do it, and that we should do it in the context of our current school structure. And then if we choose to move to another arrangement of our schools into faculties, then we will move the resources across into that structure and manage accordingly. I know this has been raised by a number of people and a concern, and I recognise it as a concern at the moment, and it certainly seems to me to be a set of circumstances that, as I mentioned earlier, are not going to change in a hurry. We need to get through the shared services process as quickly as we can.
I think we might just go to the question here, the gentleman in the red jumper.
We need a mathematical question, I think, at this stage.
Well, this is not a mathematical question, Barney, but a research question. Yeah. So we've heard a little bit about the risk of silos inside faculties, which I think is a real risk. And I'm just wondering whether we can use research institutions like the centres as a way to break those silos down. So, for instance, in my centre, the centre that I lead for research in mathematics, we are trying to build links with other institutions, other centres and other schools. So I wonder if centres sit inside faculties, then they might have school-based members. I mean, all of our members are, in fact, normal teaching and research academics who sit in the school, but also have a foot in a centre that has people associated from other schools. And so you could break down some of those silos through the research links.
I think the research dimension to any restructure is a critical one, and you're touching on one aspect of that. And I agree with you, the role that centres play. Centres, we'll come to institutes in a moment, but the role that centres play in providing us with opportunities to be creative in the way in which we can focus our research effort. I like our research themes, which Scott Holmes and Deb Sweeney have been working on, and our theme champions. I think this is a great initiative, and I think it's bringing people together in new ways to think about how we tackle these global challenges as an institution, as a university. We need to be thinking about our, as I said earlier, our global perspective and the contribution we can make at that level. So I agree with you. Our centres have this opportunity to do that because they are largely emerging from schools, and they can bring people across disciplines together, and their foothold, if you like, their anchor point is back into a school structure. Our Research Institute directors, I think, have expressed a very strong view to Sharon of concern about moving to a faculty model if the institutes are going to be embedded in the faculty. And I think they're very passionate, in fact, about their concerns, and I recognise that. And I think it's one of the issues we're looking forward to other comments, but I think our Research Institute directors see real dangers here to the institutes if, in fact, they're embedded in an environment where they won't have necessarily the autonomy or the direct connection to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor research to ensure that their successes can be built on and further developed. And I recognise that. Equally, I think we need to find ways, and this is the challenge, I guess, for centres and institutes, to better work with schools, to find better ways to engage. I think we've made some progress in the last 2 or 3 years. Scott Holmes, I think, as DVC, has been finding ways to incentivise greater collaboration between institutes and schools, but I think it hasn't gone far enough. I don't think we're getting the outcomes that we can achieve. both from our institutes, but importantly by bringing colleagues from schools in a more significant way into our institutes. I don't think we have as many joint appointments between schools and institutes as we should have. I think we should do more in that regard. That anchors people partly into a school at least. And you could argue that that's easier to achieve in a faculty structure than it may be with a standalone set of institutes outside of a faculty structure, or for that matter, outside of a school structure. So, I think we need to work this set of issues around research through in this consultation process. I know Sharon's been talking to me about some of the comments that have been made, and I'm very conscious that Marks and HIE and ICS and NICM already is within the school structure of science and health, but is a significant research institute. The Whitlam Institute, the Australia-China Institute for Arts and Culture, the Translational Health Research Institute. They're existing, in some cases they're quite fledgling and new, in other cases established, successful, and they've been the drivers of our research productivity in recent years. So we're conscious of all of those elements. We need to work through a solution here, or at least a proposal in the white paper that will emerge, that is going to provide us with confidence that we can ensure the positive things are maintained, but also address some of those challenges around bringing people together across schools, institutes and centres. So the research dimension, I'm not sure if you want to add something on this around the discussions you've had, Sharon.
Well, I think one of the things that the Vice-Chancellor and I have been talking about too is thinking into the future about research. How are we supporting centres and how do we see centres? Obviously not all centres, but where are the next, if you like, institute level entities going to rise from? We're looking at what can actually create that dynamic system so that we're ensuring that we're actually growing areas of great and significant strength, as well as maintaining those areas where there is great strength, and hoping that we can really not dilute the research effort, but ensure that there is the opportunity for that dynamism in the system. So that's really important to be thinking about. It's not about, again, it's not about maintaining the status quo.
It seems to me at the moment, we don't see, I'm a little surprised that we don't see more emerging strength from our centres challenging to be institutes. By virtue of their success in securing external funding, their publication success, the strength of their partnerships with external agencies, organisations, industry, business and so on, that starts to push the envelope here of saying we really should be standing up at institute level, and the university then should be saying, how can we find the resources to support another institute? It's not happening in the way I imagine it should for an institution as significant as Western Sydney University at the moment. And I wonder, well, this is not quite the dynamic we want. So how do we support that, the change?
So perhaps before we go to another question from the floor, we've talked a lot about research. We haven't said very much about international, yet international is obviously a really significant imperative for the university in terms of our future development. And again, I wonder if you would reflect on whether you think the current structures are serving us well in terms of our international success. And that of course includes not just student recruitment, but the development of strong partnerships.
Yeah, I think the best we could describe at the moment is it's patchy across the university. And I think one of the arguments you could that you could put for a change to a faculty structure would be to get greater focused attention on international. I think we've come a long way in the last 2 or 3 years to address some of the underlying challenges. We've had either visa issues and visa risk issues that we've been dealing with, Linda Taylor's been doing a great job on, or whether it's our international partnerships becoming much more mutually beneficial, not just inbound student numbers to us, but opportunities for outbound mobility. We've done well on New Colombo plan. We're making progress. But if you look at the raw data, the university's only grown in total EFSL 2014 to 2016 by about 10% in international terms, off a very low base. So we're sitting at around 3,600 EFSL at the moment. To give you an idea, Charles Sturt sits at well over 5,000. In the last 3 years, the University of Sydney and the University of New South Wales grew by over 9,000. So we remain, in the context of the Australian system, as a university with a very modest both total load, but also a very modest percentage of our total load. Now, in many ways, I think that's a good position to grow from. You know, you have some universities in Australia pushing 40% international, and it's creating some really challenging circumstances for them. So we can build our load, I think, quite successfully. We need to get some focused effort. I think one of the initiatives that we've put in place, which has been quite a challenge to get all of the schools to support this, but our Associate Deans International that operate in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong and Macau, very important market for us. Very important that we have the language and cultural skills to operate effectively in those markets, and that we know the challenges of relationship management in that region. And that's certainly not about a Vice-Chancellor flying in once a year to have a chat. It's very much about regular contact, detailed negotiations, real effort, mutual benefit, collaboration at research level as well as at the level of twinning and articulation, and to have our staff on the ground in those countries regularly enough to make a difference. We need to mature and become much more sophisticated in our international strategy. I think it's arguable that that's much easier to achieve with a faculty structure. And in the context of where we are at the moment, coming back to that first point I made about volatility in the domestic side of student load, well, the bigger universities are managing that very effectively because of growth in international student numbers. We don't have that opportunity yet. So I think we're looking at a number of new initiatives to bolster international over the next couple of years, and at the same time lift both the English language skills of our incoming students and although we have many very fine international students, to lift their academic credentials as well. So we're looking at I think, an exciting period for international. But I'd argue that a faculty structure might make this easier for us rather than more difficult.
There's several questions from the floor.
I'll just pick up a part of what you were talking about a few minutes ago. Is almost whatever the structure that we put in place, what are the factors that may influence the effectiveness or otherwise of that? I guess an observation I might make is that our focus tends to be very much in the way we function on minimizing risk rather than encouraging innovation. We have fantastic structures to de-risk and processes, but is there a structure that actually encourages innovation? And related to that is, do we really delegate enough? Are we really assigning accountability, responsibility down the line? And that may well produce a more innovative, growth-focused organization. So my question is all around not just what does the organization tree look like, but what are the factors, whatever that tree looks like, that are going to make that work more effectively?
So can I suggest, given the time, that rather than ask the Vice-Chancellor to answer that question, that I throw that back to you and say we would be really interested to have comment from you and your colleagues about, in fact, what we can do. That's a really important question. How can we actually balance? Obviously, there's a whole lot of compliance measures that now are part of the sector, which we have to respond to, but we don't want to be an organisation which is compliance-driven. Innovation and creativity are absolutely critical. So what can we be doing in that space? It's the right question. What can we be doing that would actually make a difference? Yeah. So we might go to another question, if that's all right.
It's a very good question, though. Let's work on it. I think I know we have some Associate Deans International in the room, actually, and I know the frustration they feel in various places because of this sense that, you know, they're not empowered enough, they can't get on with, you know, in a risk-managed way, actually achieving some real outcomes for the university. So there's a palpable need to address that.
This is not a question, but a comment, and to build on what you just touched on with regards to internationalization of the university. I came into Western Sydney in 2013 to do my master's. And in 2014, that was when you came on board as the Vice-Chancellor. I started a program which was my PhD, and you initiated something which was the fee waiver for students who were doing well. And I think I was one of the beneficiaries of that fee waiver in collaboration with my supervisor as well. And just on my way to this talk, I got an email saying that approved to graduate from my PhD in this coming year. So I just think such initiatives are really, really important for the university because, again, I'm also working as a lecturer in the university as well. So just to kind of say thank you for the initiatives. And I believe change is hard, but I think it still has his own benefits as well.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
And fee waiver scholarships for very good PhD students is actually not a difficult decision to make. And it's a very important one to PhD students are the lifeblood of our research activity, and we need to support them wherever we can and to bring them from all over Australia and all over the world. We'll continue to do that.
Yep. We've just got one last question that's come through, or it's actually more of a comment than a question that's come through the webinar. The 4 faculty model, smaller schools is my preferred model because I feel it will put greater responsibility back to the discipline groups. This has been lost in the super school structure. Grassroots course development begins with the experts in the field, the discipline groups. This must be the focus of any change.
Well, I think the question of substructure is an important one, and we do invite people to reflect on it, and even in a little more detail than that. There's costs associated with substructures we have to manage. And I think that will be one of the challenges. But and I think, again, reflecting back on some of the negative views of the college structure, I think there was a real sense that schools felt isolated, starved of resources, not involved in decision making. You know, we've got to ensure that we don't go back and recreate a system that's going to enable that to occur. So we need to balance all of those things out. But substructure, we need to have a chat about it.
Absolutely. Now, I'm mindful of the time. Have we got time for one more question? There's one here.
One last question?
One last question,
yeah,
yes.
Miroslav.
Well, thanks very much. What do I know as a scientist? There's only one thing worse than a restructure. And that's a wrong structure. So I think, we should all keep that in mind. From the bottom of the floor, from the mine where I sit, working with the students, I see a lot of deficiencies, not these external problems and pressures and challenges that you've been talking most of the time today, completely different sets of challenges that I see that the present structure brings. But that's not my question. My question is about the future. My question is about my 14-year-old Sophia, my daughter, which is now 14-year-old. She will be in 2020, she will be a student. She wants to study medicine. That's her passion. She found that University of Bologna offers course in medicine for 2,000 euros per year. It's one of the best schools in Europe, well-known schools. What can we offer to my Sophia in 2020 in terms of the structure, in terms of the future, in terms of the future academics? After all, structure is irrelevant. It's all about us working here. It doesn't matter how good structure on paper you can have. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So are we really looking for 2020? Are we really looking for new challenges, new people, new initiatives? Or are we going to just shift the chairs around the deck? Thank you.
Well, I think we're in a strategic planning process which is genuinely looking to sharpen our 2020 vision for the university. And I'm sure that we are aspiring to deliver a university in 2020 that is built on the great university we have today. And European universities are very interesting. Bologna is a very old university and a great university. And the fee structures, international students have access freely to education in Europe. That's one of the great things of the European model. In Australia, I think one of the challenges right at the moment is that the income contingent loan system we operate under that has made higher education accessible to everyone is under pressure. It's under pressure again by changes that are being flagged by the Minister in this budget. So we have to work through the externalities. They're impacting upon us. But on a daily basis, I see this university doing some outstanding things. And I know the work you're doing and your group is doing is right up there with the work we're doing in a whole range of areas. And I'm proud of that, and we'll continue to build and support that. We will be a comprehensive university in Western Sydney. We will meet our global aspirations, I can assure you of that. And I think increasingly we'll be the university of choice.
I think that's a very good note on which to finish. So I'd like to conclude by thanking the Vice-Chancellor and thanking you for being a fantastic audience, and to everyone who has joined us live on the webinar. Thank you for the questions that you've sent in.
Thanks, Sharon.